Hi, and welcome to part 2 of this unit's lecture on moving lithosphere. Now don't forget, the lithosphere is the crust and the upper part of the mantle. Now, Continental Drift Theory was first proposed officially and kind of academically in 1912 by a German guy named Alfred Wegener. Unfortunately, he had really bad timing because that was right before World War I, so nobody in the West wanted to believe what he had to say, and also he was a weatherman and not a geologist, so that's another kind of strike against him. Before he came around, some random scattered people had proposed that the continents moved around, but there was pretty much a scientific sense of agreement among all scientists that the continents were static, that they didn't move, and that they had always been where they were now. The theory, though, says that the continents not only are drifting now, but have been drifting for millions of years, squishing together, coming apart, and so on. Wegener's ideas went back millions of, his theory proposed that millions of years ago, all the Earth's major continents were joined as one big single landmass called Pangaea. As you can see, the shape of the continents has basically remained the same over the millions of years, but their position relative to each other has changed. And Wegener was actually pretty spot on about this. It makes sense. One of the pieces of evidence that he used was the kind of weird similarities between the coastlines of, say, Africa on the one hand and the Americas on the other. It kind of looks like they would fit together if you just slid them to each other. You guys might have actually noticed this when you were like 10 years old in 3rd grade, just kind of looking at the globe. And people before Wegener had noticed this and thought it was kind of weird, but the continents were considered so heavy that the idea of them moving just didn't make any sense at all. This illustration is actually a demonstration of how it could have happened, drawn up by somebody actually in the 1800s, so 100 years before Wegener. And again, so this idea wasn't entirely new, the idea of continental drift, but Wegener was the first person who proposed it in kind of a modern form. And what was important about his ideas was that he didn't just look at the shape of the landmass, but he also used fossil evidence for his claims. Importantly, a lot of dead animals that say couldn't jump from the east coast of Africa and swim across the Indian Ocean to say the middle of India, and from there swim on down to Antarctica. That the remains of these animals were found in all of these unconnected places. Now, it's true, a lot of geologists had thought that these things were kind of strange and needed an explanation, but that just caused them to draw weird speculative land bridges between all the different continents, kind of connecting areas where fossils were similar, which, when you added up all the land bridges, you had a really weird-looking globe that doesn't make any sense at all. And that's one reason we kind of laugh at these guys. But it's important to remember that for about 50 years, everybody laughed at Wegener. He was not taken seriously. Largely because, well, not largely because, also because he had all this evidence that this is the way it probably was in the past, but he couldn't come up with some kind of method for this to happen. And for that, it took the development of a different theory in the 1950s and 60s. This theory is called the Theory of Plate Tectonics. And in fact, Wegener didn't even really know about plates. It's kind of shocking how recently plates were discovered, since they're such an important part of making the Earth look the way it looks. The Theory of Plate Tectonics and the Continental Drift Theory go together. Think of Continental Drift Theory as a description of what things looked like, and plate tectonics as an explanation of why things look like that and how they got to be where they are now. So, as the name will tell you, the first important advance of plate tectonics is this idea of plates at all. And the theory says that the surface of the Earth is composed of rigid, meaning kind of non-flexible, moving crustal plates. The rigidity part is important because if the surface plates were just kind of gooey, they would meld into each other, and they wouldn't say break off. They wouldn't create earthquakes. They wouldn't create mountains. All of these things that that can only happen when there's some kind of breaking occurring. As you know, there are about about a dozen larger major plates and an assortment of minor ones. They're very thin. They're only about 62 miles thick on average, and they're actually a lot thicker in places where mountains are than they are where the oceans are. So sometimes you can get plates of a couple hundred miles thick, and sometimes only a few miles thick in very thin crusted ocean areas. You compare the thickness of the crust, though, to, say, the thickness of the mantle, which is about 2,000 miles thick on average, and you get an idea of just how kind of thin and potentially brittle and fragile the crust is. If the Earth were actually, say the Earth was the size of an orange, the difference between the highest spots on Earth in the Himalayas and the lowest spots in the Earth, in the Marianas Trench in the Pacific, would be smaller than the difference between one of the big bumps and one of the little kind of divots on that orange. So even these great changes in elevation on the crust are really tiny when you compare it to the size of the Earth overall. And as you can see, a couple more ideas that come with plate tectonics are that the plates are not just, don't get the idea that, say, the plates are the continent, the land part, and they're just floating around on top of say, water or melted rock. The plate extends out into the middle of the ocean, and some plates are strictly oceanic, although it is true that some plates do end at about the coastline. But just so you know, there's not like a one-to-one correspondence between where the plates end and where the continents end. So, as I was saying, the really important part of plate tectonics has to do with explaining how the continents move around. And there's one main mechanism here.
Mr. Hyder, what's that mechanism?
What a good question, seniors. Well, that mechanism is basically convection, the same type of convection that we learned about when we were talking about why precipitation occurs. You have to keep in mind that the upper mantle is gooey. I'm told it's like a Tootsie Roll that stayed in your pockets on a hot day. So it can kind of ooze around. And since the rocks in the mantle, which are gooey in some places, are of different heat levels, you got to remember, hot things like to expand, and that makes them less dense, and so that makes them be kind of less drawn to the center of Earth's gravity than dense, colder rocks. The same way that cold air falls, colder rocks will fall. In the same way that hot air rises, hot taffy-like rocks will rise within the mantle. So this process of the hot rocks rising, getting close to the crust, and thus giving off a little heat as they rising close to the crust. And as you know, when they give off heat, the same thing that has happened with air happens. It becomes cooler and more dense, thus causing it to sink back down. And so you have a convection cycle, basically a circular movement of gooey mantle rock. Now, where the crusts luck out is they get to hitch a ride on the gooey mantle rock. So as the mantle is kind of oozing or gooeyly flowing in different ways, it brings the very thin, basically light slabs of crustal plate along with it on top. And because the convection cycles within the mantle are not going all in one uniform direction, that indicates that the same thing is going to happen to the plates. In some cases, they're going to be crushing into each other. In some places, they're going to be kind of sliding past each other. In some cases, they're going to be twirling. Some cases, moving apart. So you have a lot of different ways that this crustal movement will be will be manifested on the Earth's surface. And that's something we're going to get to in the next section of our note. The main thing to keep in mind now, though, is that this happens at a really, really slow pace, no faster than your fingernails grow, although it is true that different plates will interact with each other at different speeds. Some plates are moving really fast, like I think the Nazca plate off of South America. But so you have to go back, to get to Pangaea, you have to go back about 225 million years, which is, kind of a long way back. The Earth has really only looked the way it looks right now in some kind of recognizable form for about 1% of its total existence. And we don't really even know what the Earth looked like before Pangaea. It's kind of hard to trace back beyond that due to the difficulty of finding fossils, the kind of confusion of evidence, and all of that. So poor Alfred Wegener never lived to see anyone accept his theory. He died in Greenland, I think. He was just on an expedition, and he froze to death, and they buried him right there. The end. Hi, it's me again. I was told that was kind of a weird way to end this, so I'm going to end this with a joke. What gets closer to you at the rate of about 1 inch per year? Alfred Wegener. He's in Greenland, but it's coming closer.